The journey home begins. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm golden streaks over the vast African landscape. A minibus, its white paint faded and streaked with dust, rumbled along the winding dirt road, carrying 9 students who had just finished their semester. Their voices filled the air with laughter, anticipation, and the endless chatter of plans for the holiday break. Kayameka sat by the window, her dark eyes fixed on the road ahead. Her heart swelled with excitement at the thought of home, her mother's cooking, the familiar scent of palm oil and smoked fish, the warmth of the little house where she had grown up. After months away at university, she longed to feel her mother's embrace again. Next to her, Ollie stretched his arms and let out a satisfied sigh. "I swear, the moment I get home, I'm going to eat everything in sight. A whole pot of jollof rice, gone. You guys won't believe how much my mother spoils me." Tommy, seated across from him, smirked. "You? Finishing an entire pot? Please. I'll believe it when I see it." "I'm serious," Ollie insisted. "If I don't gain at least 5 kilos before the semester starts again, then something is wrong." The others laughed, the conversation shifting to food, home, and gifts. Bola talked about the presents she had bought for her younger siblings, while Kumi promised to sleep for 3 straight days once he got home. The minibus driver, an old man with graying hair and a face like dried yam, tapped his fingers against the steering wheel as he listened to their chatter. "You young ones," he chuckled. "Always thinking about food and sleep. You should be grateful for the journey itself. The road is long, but it leads you home." Kayameka smiled. There was something comforting about his words. The road stretched ahead, smooth and straight, flanked by towering trees whose leaves rustled in the evening breeze. Everything about this journey felt perfect, like a scene from an old folktale where nothing could go wrong. Then, suddenly, the bus began to slow. The driver squinted at something ahead and let out a low murmur. "What's that?" All conversation died as the students leaned forward, peering through the windshield. A woman stood by the side of the road, waving desperately. She was old, draped in a grey wrapper that hung loosely around her thin frame. Her skin was dark and wrinkled, her eyes filled with desperation. Beside her, a battered old wagon leaned to one side, one of its wheels completely broken. "Help me," she called out, her voice cracking. "Please, my children, help me." The students exchanged uneasy glances. "Driver, stop," Boa said firmly. He was the gentle one, always the first to offer help. The driver's grip tightened on the wheel. He shook his head. No, we keep going. This road is dangerous. People disappear." Tommy frowned. "But she's an old woman. How can we just leave her here?" Ali hesitated. "Maybe we should listen to the driver. He knows the area." "But what if she's someone's grandmother?" Tommy pressed. "Wouldn't you want someone to help your own grandmother?" The students murmured in agreement. The driver let out a long sigh, muttering under his breath, but he pulled over. The moment the bus stopped, Kayameka felt something shift. A strange heaviness in the air. Ignoring her unease, she was the first to step out, offering the woman a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Mama," she said. "We'll help you." The old woman's lips curled into a grateful smile, but something about it felt wrong. First. Then, before anyone could react, she brought 2 fingers to her lips and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. It was a sound that sliced through the air like a blade. The students barely had time to register it before figures erupted from the dense undergrowth. 5 men, masked, armed, their movements fast and practiced. The students screamed, but the men moved too quickly. Guns were raised. Commands were shouted. "Down," one of them barked. Terror turned their legs to stone. What is this?" Kumi stammered, his voice shaking. Do as I say, or I will shoot, the man roared. The students fell to their knees, trembling, their minds scrambling to process what was happening. One of the men yanked Kayameka's arms behind her back and began tying them with thick rope. Her wrist burned as the rough fibers bit into her skin. She gasped, struggling against the bindings, but it was useless. The others were being restrained just as quickly. Tommy was crying. Bola was breathing fast, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow gasps. One of the kidnappers grabbed Ollie's phone and tossed it to the side. No calls, he muttered. The old woman, the one they had stopped to help, was gone. And so was their freedom. Move, another voice commanded. Blindfolds were pulled over their eyes, plunging them into suffocating darkness. The students were shoved forward, stumbling as their captors forced them into the unknown. The forest swallowed them whole. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the musty aroma of old trees. Every footstep crunched against fallen leaves, every breath came out shaky and uneven. The whispers of the forest grew louder, rustling like unseen voices murmuring secrets in the dark. Kayameka's mind raced. How had this happened? One moment, they had been laughing, planning their Christmas, and now. Terror gripped her chest. What did these men want? Money? Ransom? Or something far worse? She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but all she could do was walk. The hands pushing her forward were rough, unyielding. She tripped over a root, landing hard on her knees. Before she could cry out, a strong hand yanked her back up. No slowing down, a deep voice growled in her ear. A sob caught in her throat. The sounds of the road had faded completely. They were deep in the forest now. And nobody knew where they were. At last, they stopped. The blindfolds were ripped off. Blinking against the dim light, Kayameka and the others looked around. They were in a clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed older than time itself. A single fire crackled in the center, casting flickering shadows on the rough faces of their captors. The leader of the kidnappers stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. Call your families, he ordered, tossing their phones at them. Tell them to send money. If they don't, you die. The students hesitated. One of the men pulled a knife from his belt and pressed it against Tommy's cheek. Do it. Now. Hands shaking, they obeyed. Kayameka's fingers fumbled as she dialed. Her mother answered on the first ring. Chi. My child. Why are you calling so late? Mama, Kayameka's voice broke. They kidnapped us. They want money, please. The kidnapper snatched the phone from her hands before she could say more. If you want your daughter back, he said coldly, bring the money before sunset tomorrow. Then he hung up. Kayameka's heart pounded. She knew the truth. Her mother had no money. And that meant she was going to die, the forest of no return. The forest had always been a place of mystery. Even as a child, Kayameka had heard stories of the old trees, tales whispered by her grandmother about spirits that roamed the shadows, about those who entered but never returned. Now, blindfolded and bound, she felt those stories breathing down her neck. The kidnappers pushed them deeper into the wilderness, their heavy boots crunching against the leaf-strewn earth. Every step was agony. The ropes cut into Kayameka's wrist, the fibers rough and unyielding against her skin. The scent of damp moss and decaying leaves filled her nostrils. Somewhere behind her, Tommy whimpered. Please, we can't keep walking. My feet. A hard shove silenced her. No talking, one of the kidnappers snapped. His voice was deep, gravelly, like someone who had smoked too many cigarettes in his lifetime. Kayameka bit her lip, forcing herself to focus. We have to survive. We have to get out. She couldn't see, but she could hear. The sound of their surroundings had changed. The chirping of crickets had vanished. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze on the roadside, was now eerily still. The forest was too quiet. Even the kidnappers had noticed. One of them muttered something in a low voice, and another responded in a language Kayamika didn't understand. Their tone was different now, tense, uneasy. She strained to listen. Then, suddenly, a loud crack split the silence. A branch breaking. The kidnappers froze. The students barely dared to breathe. Then, before anyone could react, something moved in the trees. It was fast. Too fast. A blur of motion, a rustling so rapid that it seemed unnatural. Kayamika's heartbeat slammed against her ribs. What was that? The kidnappers recovered quickly, their fear masked by anger. Move, one of them barked, shoving the students forward. The march continued, but the feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. An unseen presence. They walked for what felt like hours, the ropes on their wrists chafing their skin raw. The moon had risen, casting a silver glow through the thick canopy of trees. When the kidnappers finally stopped, the students collapsed onto the cold earth, panting. Their blindfolds were ripped off. Kayamika blinked against the dim firelight, her eyes adjusting to the scene before her. They were in a small clearing, surrounded by massive trees. A campfire flickered in the center, casting long, wavering shadows on the dirt ground. Around it, the kidnappers stood like wolves, their expressions unreadable. The students huddled together. Ali turned to Kayamika, his voice barely a whisper. What do they want with us? She swallowed hard. Ransom. And if our families don't pay? Kayamika didn't answer. She didn't have to. They both knew the truth. A man stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his eyes cold and hard. The rules are simple, he said. His voice was eerily calm. You will call your families. You will tell them to pay. He let his gaze sweep over the students. If they refuse. His fingers traced the handle of the machete strapped to his belt. The message was clear. One by one, the students were handed their phones. Ali dialed first. His hands trembled. Mama, he whispered, his voice cracking. Please, The phone was yanked away. If you want your son back, the kidnapper told his mother, bring the money before sunset tomorrow. The call ended. One by one, the students made their calls. Some parents promised to send money immediately. Others hesitated. Then, it was Kayamika's turn. She gripped the phone tightly, her breath shallow. The line rang once. Twice. Then, Kayamika. Her mother's voice. Warm. Familiar. Tears burned behind Kayamika's eyes. Mama, she choked. The kidnapper snatched the phone away. If you want to see your daughter alive, you will pay. By tomorrow. A long silence. Then, her mother spoke. I don't have money. The kidnapper's expression darkened. Then she dies, he said flatly. The call ended. Kayamika's stomach twisted. She was going to die. The first death. That night, the students barely slept. The kidnappers sat around the fire, drinking, laughing, while their captives huddled together in silence. Sei, one of the boys, kept whispering prayers under his breath. God, please, let us live. The fire crackled. The night stretched on. Then, the leader of the kidnappers stood. His eyes landed on Sei. You. Sei's body went rigid. The kidnapper's lips curled into a cruel smile. Your family didn't pay. No, Sei's breath came in short gasps. No, please. The leader pulled him up by his collar, dragging him toward the edge of the clearing. The students screamed. Tommy lunged forward, but a kidnapper struck her across the face. Sei kicked and thrashed, his cries piercing the night. Then, a gunshot. Silence. Sei's body hit the ground. A muffled sob escaped Bola's lips. Kayameka clenched her fist, trying to stop her own shaking. They had to get out. They had to run. Something is watching. The kidnappers returned to their places, their faces unreadable. But something was different now. The forest was angry. The wind picked up, calling around the fire in unnatural swirls. The flames flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows against the trees. Then, a whisper. Low. Ancient. It rippled through the air, a sound so soft yet so full of power that it made even the kidnappers shift uncomfortably. One of the men glanced at the trees, then spat on the ground. Just the wind. But Kayameka knew better. She had heard that voice before. A story from her childhood. A warning passed down through generations. The ancestors protect their land. And tonight, the forest had witnessed blood spilled on sacred ground. The first vanishing. It happened suddenly. One moment, the leader of the kidnappers was sitting by the fire, his rifle resting beside him. The next, he was gone. No sound. No struggle. Just gone. The others leaped to their feet, their eyes wide with fear. Where is he? One of them shouted. The students barely dared to breathe. The wind howled. The trees whispered. Then, something laughed. Not a human laugh. Not something of this world. It echoed through the trees, chilling, taunting. The remaining kidnappers grabbed their guns. This place is cursed, one of them hissed. The others nodded. The students exchanged glances. Maybe, just maybe, this was their chance. A forest that hungers. The clearing was deathly silent. The fire flickered, casting restless shadows across the terrified faces of the remaining kidnappers. Their leader, gone. No sound, no struggle, no trace of him left behind. One moment, he had been seated by the fire, drinking from his metal cup. The next, he had simply vanished. The students, still bound, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Kayameka felt her breath hitch in her throat. This was not normal. The tallest kidnapper, the one they called Konyu, stood frozen, his fingers tightening around his rifle. His voice, once full of arrogance, was now edged with unease. What the hell just happened? No one answered. The wind had picked up again, swirling through the trees in a strange, unnatural way. The branches creaked and moaned, whispering secrets in the dark. Then, from the trees came laughter. Low. Whispery. Ancient. It was not human. The kidnappers spun toward the sound, their guns raised. Who's there? Konyu barked, his voice raw. Silence. Then, another sound, the rustling of leaves. Something was moving through the underbrush. Fast. Watching. Hunting. Konyu took a step back, his eyes darting left and right. We need to get out of here, he stammered. The others nodded, gripping their weapons tighter. But then, one of the kidnappers screamed. Everyone turned just in time to see him yanked backward into the shadows. The firelight barely caught a glimpse of something huge and dark pulling him into the trees. The scream cut off abruptly. The students shrank back, their terror mounting. Oli's voice was barely a whisper. The forest is alive. Kayameka felt her stomach tighten. This was no ordinary kidnapping. Something much older had been awakened. Fear begins to break them. Konyu's breathing was ragged. He turned to the remaining two kidnappers, his voice shaking. We leave. Now. One of the others, a stocky man with a scar across his cheek, spat onto the ground. We have hostages. We finish what we came for. The hell we do? Konu snapped. You saw what happened. That thing, it took them. We stay here, we're next. The students stayed silent, their bound hands trembling. Kayameka spoke softly, choosing her words carefully. This land is old, she murmured. The spirits protect it. Konu turned on her, his face twisting in anger. Shut up. But there was something in his eyes, fear. Kayameka pressed on. You spilled blood on sacred ground. The forest will not let you leave. The scarred man scoffed. Superstitions. Then, a single gunshot rang out. Everyone flinched. But no one had fired. The sound had come from the trees. The remaining kidnappers exchanged wary glances. Then, a voice, the voice of their leader. Or at least, it sounded like him. Help me. The voice was distant, weak, twisting through the trees like smoke. The scarred man narrowed his eyes. Boss. No response. Konu gritted his teeth, lifting his rifle. That's not him. The students held their breath. Then, from the darkness, the missing kidnapper stumbled back into the clearing. His face was wrong. His eyes were empty, staring ahead but seeing nothing. His mouth hung open, as though mid-scream, yet no sound came out. And then, he collapsed. Dead. Konu jumped back, his rifle raised. What the? The scarred man knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse. His expression hardened. He's cold. He's been dead for hours. The student's fear deepened. How was that possible? He had just disappeared minutes ago. Ali whispered, this forest doesn't follow time. Kayameka felt her heart pound in agreement. The scarred man cursed under his breath. This is nonsense. I say we finish the job, take what we can, and... Then, suddenly, his body was lifted off the ground. Not by human hands. By the roots of a nearby tree. They coiled around his legs, his arms, wrapping around his throat like living ropes. His gun clattered to the ground as he gasped, choking. Konu and the remaining kidnapper watched, their faces pale with horror. The students could only stare in frozen shock. The man vanished into the trees. His scream lasted only a second. Then, silence. The forest had taken him. Desperate measures. Only 2 kidnappers remained now, Konu and a thin, nervous-looking man called Luca. Luca was trembling. We have to run, he whispered. Konu's hands were clenched into fists. But his arrogance was gone. His confidence had shattered. He turned to the students, his eyes burning. You. Kayameka swallowed. What? You know something. He marched toward her, grabbing her by the arm and shaking her. Tell me how to stop this. Kayameka's voice wavered. The forest doesn't want you here. That's not an answer. Konu roared. How do I make it stop? Kayameka hesitated. Then, she remembered. Her grandmother's stories. The old ways. She met Konu's gaze. You must return what you have taken. Luca, still shaking, muttered, the girl is right. We should just let them go. Konu glared at him. Are you insane? If we leave them, we get nothing. Luca shook his head. If we stay, we die. Silence. Then, another whisper from the forest. It was soft, gentle. Give them back. Luca let out a strangled cry, his nerves finally breaking. He turned and ran. Straight into the trees. The forest swallowed him whole. The path to freedom. Only Konu remained. His face was ghostly pale, his hands trembling. Slowly, he turned to the students. Go. No one moved. He snarled, stepping back. I said go. The students hesitated for only a second. Then, they ran. Kayameka's legs burned as she sprinted, her hands still bound, Ali beside her. Tommy was sobbing, but she kept moving. The trees blurred past them. The air was thick, heavy, as though something was pushing against them. Then, a new sound. Footsteps. Someone was running behind them. Kayameka chanced a glance over her shoulder. Connie was following them. A gun in his hands. You're not leaving me here. He bellowed, his voice cracking. The students ran faster. But then, Connie screamed. His voice was different. Terrified. Kayameka turned just in time to see his body lifted into the air. A shadowy figure, tall, with glowing white eyes, had appeared behind him. It wasn't a man. It wasn't human. Connie struggled, but the entity was too strong. It held him like a toy, as though judging him. Then, it whispered something into his ear. And Connie's body fell apart. Not ripped. Not broken. Just dissolved into ash. The forest had judged him. And the forest had decided escape. The students reached the forest edge just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. A village lay ahead, small and quiet, its huts lined with lanterns that flickered warmly in the early morning light. They had made it. The spirits had let them live. Kayameka fell to her knees, gasping for breath. And behind them, deep in the trees, the whispers faded. The spirits of the forest had returned to sleep. For now. A broken dawn. The first light of dawn painted the sky in muted shades of pink and orange. The students stumbled forward, their bodies aching, their lungs burning. Their feet scraped against the uneven ground as they ran, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the nightmare they had just escaped. Kayameka felt her legs weaken beneath her, but she refused to stop. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, her breath shallow and ragged. Ali was beside her, his face pale with exhaustion, his eyes darting around as if expecting another monster to emerge from the trees. They had survived the night. But something felt wrong. The forest was behind them, yet it felt as though it was watching. Kayameka risked a glance over her shoulder. The trees stood still, unmoving, their massive trunks stretching into the sky like silent sentinels. Yet, the air carried an unnatural heaviness. Something wasn't right. Something was coming the village at the edge of the forest. As they reached the outskirts of a small village, the students collapsed onto the dirt path, gasping for breath. A few villagers, startled by their sudden appearance, rushed toward them. "Who are you?" an elderly man asked, his voice filled with concern. His white robe fluttered slightly in the early morning breeze, his wrinkled face shadowed with wisdom. Kayameka tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. It was Ali who finally managed to stammer out the words. We were kidnapped." Gasps spread through the gathered villagers. A woman, her baby wrapped tightly to her back, stepped forward. "You came from the forest." The way she said it made Kayameka shiver. "Yes," Tommy whispered, her voice trembling. "We barely made it out." The old man nodded slowly. "Then you carry its curse." The students froze. "What?" Bola asked, her voice hoarse. The old man motioned for them to follow. "Come inside. We must cleanse you before it's too late." The elders warning. Inside a large hut, the students sat on woven mats, their bodies too weak to protest. The old man, who introduced himself as Eldankem, carefully inspected each of them. "You should not be alive," he murmured. Kayameka frowned. "What do you mean?" The elder sighed. Many who are taken by the forest never return. He glanced toward the open doorway, where the thick trees loomed in the distance. It is not a place for men. It belongs to the forgotten ones. Ollie shifted uneasily. The forgotten ones. Eldan Kem's expression darkened. Spirits. The lost, the betrayed, the wronged. They walk those trees, punishing those who spill blood upon their land. Your captors, they awakened them. Tommy shuddered. But we didn't do anything. You were witnesses, the elder said gravely. And the forest does not forget witnesses. A cold wave of fear settled over them. Kayameka clenched her fist. What does that mean? Are we still in danger? The elder nodded. Yes. A gust of wind rushed through the hut, sending chills down their spines. The forest has marked you, he whispered. And it will come for what it is owed. The return of the dead. Night fell quickly in the village. The students, exhausted beyond measure, were given shelter in a small hut near the elder's home. Kayameka lay awake, staring at the thatched ceiling. Sleep felt impossible. She could still hear the whispers of the trees. Then, a sound. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But then, Tommy shot up beside her, eyes wide. Did you hear that? Kayameka sat up, listening. A low knocking against the wooden door. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Ali, who had been dozing in the corner, jolted awake. What was that? Nobody moved. Then, the knocking came again. Harder. More urgent. Kayameka's stomach twisted. We shouldn't open it, she whispered. Tommy nodded. Agreed. But then, a voice spoke from outside. Let me in. Kayameka's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Slowly, her body trembling, she crawled toward the door and peered through a small gap in the wood. Her heart stopped. Standing outside was Konu. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, his lips cracked and dry. He looked half dead. No. He looked wrong. His skin seemed stretched, his posture stiff. Like a puppet held up by unseen strings. Kayameka's breath hitched. Konu, she whispered. He smiled. The sight of it sent terror stabbing through her chest. Let me in, he repeated. Behind her, Ollie shook his head furiously. That's not him. That's not him. Tommy clutched Kayameka's arm. Move away from the door. Kayameka barely managed to take a step back before. Bang! Konu slammed his fist against the wood. Let me in. The entire hut shook. Shadows flickered outside. The wind howled through the village, carrying whispers with it. The forgotten ones had followed them. A desperate escape. The knocking grew more violent. The hut trembled as though the earth itself was shifting beneath them. Eldan Kem burst through the entrance, his face grim. Come with me. Now. The students obeyed without question, rushing after him as he led them through the village. Where are we going? Ali panted. The shrine, the elder said. It is the only place they cannot enter. Behind them, the wind screamed. The voices of the dead rose with it, whispering their names. Kayameka dared one last glance over her shoulder. At the edge of the village, the silhouette of the dead stood just beyond the firelight. Watching. Waiting. The shrine of protection. The shrine was a small stone structure at the edge of the village. Inside, candles flickered against the walls, casting long shadows across the carved wooden idols of the ancestors. Eldan Kem ushered them inside and slammed the door. He began chanting in a low voice, tossing dried leaves into a small fire in the center of the room. What is he doing? Tommy whispered. He is calling the spirit of protection, Kayameka murmured. The flames danced, growing higher. A sudden pressure filled the air, pressing against Kayamika's skin. Then, a new voice. Deep. Powerful. Old. You have entered our land. The students froze. The fire rose. An entity stood within the flames, tall, with glowing white eyes. You have seen what must not be seen, it rumbled. You have walked the path of the dead. Kayamika's throat was dry. We didn't want to. We were taken. The spirit's gaze burned into her. You have been marked. Ali whispered, what do we do? Elder Nkem spoke, his voice steady. You must offer something in return. Kayamika's hands curled into fists. Like what? The spirit's voice was like thunder. Alive. Silence. Tommy gasped. No, they want us to. The spirit lifted its hand. A debt was made. A price must be paid. The air shook. The walls trembled. Choose, the spirit commanded. Kayamika's heart pounded. And in that moment, she realized there was only one choice. She knew who had to be sacrificed. And he was already waiting outside. The price of survival. Kayamika's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the spirit's voice echoed through the small shrine. A debt was made. A price must be paid. Choose. The flickering fire illuminated the ancient carvings on the walls, stories of forgotten warriors, vengeful spirits, and those who dared to defy the natural order. Ali swallowed hard. They want a sacrifice. The spirit's glowing white eyes never wavered. Blood was spilled upon our land. You have entered the domain of the forgotten ones. You have seen that which must not be seen. A balance must be restored. The words sent ice through Kayamika's veins. She turned to Elder Nkem. What do we do? The old man's face was grave. There is only one way. The spirits demand justice. One among you must stay behind. Tommy let out a choked sob. You're saying one of us has to die. The wind outside howled, rattling the wooden doors of the shrine. And then, a knock. Soft. Slow. Deliberate. Kayamika's stomach twisted. She knew who it was. Konu. The man who had kidnapped them. The man who had tried to kill them. The man who should have died in the forest but had somehow returned. The whispers outside grew louder. His voice, low and wrong, seeped through the cracks in the door. Let me in. The dead do not rest. No one moved. The knocking came again, harder this time. Let me in. Ali's fingers dug into his arms. We can't. Bang. The door shook violently, as though something was ramming against it with unnatural strength. The wooden walls trembled under the force, dust falling from the thatched ceiling. The spirit within the fire did not turn, but its voice was commanding. Open the door. Face what you fear. Kayamika's pulse thundered in her ears. Elder Nkem gave her a solemn look. It must be you. Her breath hitched. What? The forest marked you first. You felt its presence before any of us. It is you who must decide. Kayamika turned back to the door, heart pounding. If she opened it, there was no telling what would happen. If she didn't. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, the wooden door creaked open on its own. A gust of wind snuffed out the candles, plunging the shrine into darkness. Kayamika's blood ran cold. The fire flared again, illuminating the figure standing in the doorway. Konu. But it wasn't him. Not really. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken, his lips cracked and dry as though he had been dead for days. But the worst part was his smile, stretched wide, too wide, as if something was wearing his face and didn't quite know how to use it. Kayameka, he crooned. Her knees nearly buckled. You should have let me take you with me, Konu whispered, stepping forward. His movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural. His head tilted at an odd angle, as if the weight of it was too much for his neck to support. Behind him, shadows moved. The forgotten ones. Watching. Waiting. Run, Ollie breathed. But Eldan Kem raised a hand. No. This is the test. Kayameka's voice trembled. What do you want? Konu grinned wider. Only what was promised. Her stomach twisted. The spirits weren't asking for a random sacrifice. They were offering one. Konu. The man who had spilled innocent blood. The man the forest had already claimed. The realization hit her like a blow. This isn't our death, she whispered. The spirit in the fire hummed in approval. You see clearly now, child. The balance was broken by him, not you. Konu took another step forward. They won't let you go unless you give them something. Kayameka's fist clenched. She wouldn't let them take anyone else. Then take him. Konu's face snapped in her direction, his pupils dilating. No, wait. The spirits moved. Dark tendrils of shadow erupted from the ground, wrapping around Konu's arms, his legs. He thrashed violently, his smile twisting into something truly monstrous. No. You can't. His screams were inhuman. His body was dragged backward, toward the darkness beyond the shrine. Kayameka turned away, her stomach churning. The last thing she saw was his fingers clawing at the ground, and then, he was gone. Swallowed by the night. The wind stopped. The whispers vanished. And in their place, an overwhelming silence. The spirits have their due. The fire dimmed. The weight in the air lifted. The spirit within the flames bowed its head. The balance is restored. The words echoed through the hut, settling in Kayameka's bones. The students barely dared to breathe. Then, slowly, the shrine doors creaked open. Outside, the forest had changed. The looming trees no longer felt like prison walls. The air no longer carried the weight of unseen eyes. The spirits were gone. The test was over. Kayameka exhaled shakily, her entire body trembling. Ali grabbed her hand. We made it, he whispered. She squeezed back, her fingers still cold. Yeah, she whispered. We did. But deep inside, she knew the forest never forgets. The journey home. By sunrise, the students left the village, escorted by local police who had finally arrived after being alerted by the elders. News of the accursed forest spread quickly. The remaining kidnappers, those who had survived, were captured wandering aimlessly in the woods, their minds shattered, their eyes hollow. When questioned, they only repeated the same words over and over again. The trees took them. Kayameka refused to look back as they drove away. She would never forget the faces of those who hadn't made it. Say, Tommy, and Konu, whose soul now belonged to the forgotten ones. As the car rumbled along the dusty road, Ollie leaned against the window, his voice quiet. Do you think we'll ever be the same? Kayameka stared at the passing trees. No. They had walked through death and survived. They had been marked by the spirits. And though they had escaped the forest, she knew, one day, the forest might call them back. But for now, they were going home. The last 3 trials. The road home is never easy. The vehicle rumbled along the dusty road, carrying the students away from the haunted village, away from the cursed forest. But as Kayameka stared out the window, she knew they were not free. The forest had marked them. The spirits had taken what they were owed, but they had also watched them. And spirits never watched without reason. Ali sat beside her, his hands gripping his knees. Tommy was silent, eyes unfocused, lost in thought. Bola kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting something, or someone, to follow them. The air in the van felt wrong. Heavy. Stifling. The police officers in the front were talking in low voices, but Kayamaka couldn't focus on their words. All she could think about was the whispering in the trees. The ancestors' warning. You have been marked. Then, the first trial began. Trial 1, the mirror of truth. The van shuddered. The students stiffened as the road beneath them turned uneven, the vehicle bouncing over what felt like deep potholes. The driver cursed under his breath. Damn road. But this was not the same road they had taken before. The trees outside were wrong. Twisted. Dark. And then, the van's headlights flickered. For a second, everything inside the vehicle went black. Kayamaka's breath caught in her throat. Then the lights returned. She blinked. And screamed. The van's interior had changed. The police officers in the front. Gone. The seats. Covered in thick, rotting vines. The windows. No longer showed the road, but the forest. And worst of all, seated beside them were their dead friends. Say, Tommy. The others. Their skin was pale. Their eyes were hollow, empty. Their mouths did not move, yet their voices filled the van. Why didn't you save us? Ali gasped, pressing himself against the door. No. No, no, this isn't real. Kayamaka's pulse pounded in her ears. The air was cold. The van was not moving anymore. And in the reflection of the cracked window beside her, she did not see herself. She saw someone else. A version of herself covered in dirt and blood. A version of herself who never escaped. You must accept the truth, a whisper slithered through the air. Kayamaka clenched her fist. This was the first trial. She turned toward the ghost. You're not real. They screamed in unison, their mouths stretching too wide. You left us. Tears burned at the edges of Kayamaka's eyes. But she forced herself to speak. No, she whispered. Then, louder, no. You're gone, but I didn't leave you. I didn't abandon you. I will never forget you, but you have to let me go. The van shook violently. Ali and the others cried out in fear. The ghost lunged at them. And then, everything snapped back to normal. The police officers were in the front. The van was moving. The road was normal again. Only the students remained gasping, shaking, their bodies drenched in sweat. None of them spoke for a long time. Trial 2, the offering of sacrifice. Kayamaka barely had time to catch her breath before the van stopped. The driver looked confused. Why did we? Then he screamed. The students turned, and their blood ran cold. The road ahead had vanished. In its place stood a circle of trees, towering into the sky, their branches woven together like fingers. And in the center, a stone altar. A single voice filled the air. A price must be paid. Ali gritted his teeth. Again. We already gave them canoe. What more do they want? The wind whispered. One more. Bola let out a sob. No. No, I can't. Kayamaka inhaled sharply. She knew what had to be done. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her grandmother's pendant. The last thing she had of her. She stepped forward. Ali grabbed her wrist. Chi, no. She shook her head. It's not a life they want. It's something that means everything to me. She walked toward the altar. The moment she placed the pendant down, the trees pulled apart. The road returned. The wind whispered one last time. The path is open. Trial 3, the heart of the lion. They were so close. The village was in sight. But then, the road turned to mist. The driver slammed the brakes. The police officers turned. What the hell is happening? Kayameka's hands shook. The last trial. Then, a figure stepped from the mist. A massive lion, made of swirling shadows and golden fire. Its eyes burned with pure power. You have faced the past. You have given your offering. But are you brave enough to go home? Ali stepped forward. Of course we are. The lion's mouth opened. Then walk through me. Silence. Bola's breathing was ragged. It's a trick. Kayameka met the lion's gaze. And walked forward. The moment she stepped into the lion's chest, fire exploded around her. Her mind filled with visions. Of the forest. Of the spirits. Of the path she was destined to take. And then, the fire faded. She was standing on the road again. Ali and the others gasped. She turned back, the lion was gone. The road was clear. The trials were over. They had a new beginning. By the time they reached the next town, the students were different. The police took their statements. The kidnappers who had survived were arrested. But Kayameka knew the truth. The spirits had chosen them for a reason. The forest had let them go, for now. But one day, it might call them back. She turned to Ollie as they walked toward the bus station. You think we'll ever be normal again? He asked. Kayameka smiled faintly. No, she said. But I think we'll be stronger. Ali nodded. As they boarded the bus that would take them home, Kayameka looked out at the trees one last time. And in the distance, for just a second, she saw a pair of glowing white eyes. Watching. Waiting. And then, they were gone. The price of freedom. The world outside the bus window was familiar, yet foreign. The sun was rising over the savannah, casting golden light over rolling fields and distant hills. Smoke curled from village huts, people walked the roads with baskets balanced on their heads, children laughed and chased each other in the early morning haze. Life was moving forward. But for Kayameka, Oli, Bola, and the others, time had stopped somewhere deep in the forest. They had made it out. They had survived. But something inside them had changed forever. The spirits had marked them. And though they were leaving the cursed land behind, they were not leaving untouched. Ali sat beside her, rubbing his wrist where the ropes had once bound him. He hadn't spoken since they left the village. None of them had. Even the bus driver, unaware of their story, seemed uneasy, as if their presence carried a weight too heavy to ignore. Kayameka ran her fingers over the empty space around her neck. Her grandmother's pendant was gone. A small sacrifice for her life. And yet, she still felt its absence like an open wound. Outside, the trees thinned. The land grew warmer, softer, welcoming them back to the world of the living. But just as Kayameka allowed herself to breathe, to believe that it was truly over, she saw it. A figure standing in the distance, just beyond the last row of trees. Tall. Shadowed. Its eyes glowing white. Watching. And then, just as the bus turned a bend in the road, it vanished. Returning to the living. Hours passed before the bus finally pulled into their city. The moment it stopped, the door flew open and the students rushed out, gasping for air, as if the weight of the journey had only now come crashing down on them. Kayameka stood in the middle of the station, disoriented. Everything was too loud. The chatter of people, the honking of cars, the scent of roasted corn from a street vendor, it all felt wrong. They had been gone for only a few days. But they were not the same people who had left. A cry split the air. Kayamaka. She barely had time to turn before her mother's arms were around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. My child. My child. Her mother sobbed, rocking her back and forth. I thought I had lost you. Kayamaka wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. The last time she had heard her mother's voice was over the phone. When she had begged for her life. When she had thought it was the last time they would ever speak. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She clutched her mother tighter. I'm home, Mama, she whispered. Her mother pulled back, cupping her face. What did they do to you? Kayamaka swallowed hard. How could she explain?